to start there we go. So some upcoming programs I want to let you know about before we get started. We have this series this fall. We have mostly celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Cook Memorial Public Library. So in support of that, the Historical Society is sponsoring two programs this fall. One is October 18th, Libertyville in the 1920s, where myself and my colleague at the library, Sonia Schoenfield, will give you highlights of what was happening in Libertyville during that decade. And then on November 15th, I will be reprising Who Was Ansel B. Cook, a presentation I did probably 5 or 6 years ago now, to give some support information for the library. And then also not in the History Matters series, but just again in celebrating the 100th anniversary of the library, Sonia and I will be doing the history of the Cook Memorial Public Library on Monday, November 8th. It's a slightly expanded version of a presentation we gave back in April. So if you attended that, thank you. You might learn a little bit more, but it will mostly be a repeat of that presentation. And I also wanted to let you know something new the Historical Society is doing this fall. We've launched our first in-person docent walking tour in anybody's memory from the Historical Society. We did it on September 12th, and we are repeating it on October 10th. So it is a stroll around Cook Park, looking at some of the buildings that you can see from the park and how they represent the first 100 years or so of Libertyville's history. So if you're interested in attending that, please email us at events@lmhistory.org to reserve your spot. And lastly, we thank you very much for coming to these programs. We also encourage you to become a financial supporter of the Historical Society. It's not a lot of money, and it really helps us in our programming, in our care of materials, in the objects we have in the cookhouse and other projects. So you can always go to our website, click on Get Involved, and join us through that page. All right. So I want to introduce our speaker this evening. We have with us Paul Bergmann. Paul is a lifelong resident of Lake Bluff, Illinois. Before venturing into corporate law, he worked at Stanley D. Anderson, beginning about the 5th grade, mainly putting away flat files and detail drawings in an estimated 10,000 drawing collection. Later, he managed correspondence for the firm. He is a board member of the Lake Bluff History Museum, and he is a past board member of the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation and the LOA Farm Foundation, which raises funds to restore and preserve barns, stables, and outbuildings at LOA Farm. When not involved in local activities, he enjoys fishing in Canada and Mexico and traveling with his partner, Janet Gibson. And last year, he published The Architecture of Stanley D. Anderson with James Tickner and William Bergmann. You can see a screenshot here. That book is available for purchase at bookstore.dorranspublishing.com. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask Paul to start sharing his screen. While we're doing that, just to let you know, I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So if you have questions, please do type them into either the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try and pick them up there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Jenny. This is wonderful. I want to thank everybody who's here for attending. And Jenny has been just a wonderful help in helping me locate buildings and find some of the farms and some of the stables. When she and I started talking about this program, she asked that I put together a program that's really centric on Libertyville and Mundelein. So even though the bulk of the firm's work was in Lake Forest, we're going to take a look at things that are in Libertyville, Mundelein. We're going to take a trip up to the Hunt Country and look at some of the stables that are up there. And I hope you all are going to enjoy. So as Jenny just pointed out, this is the front cover of my book. It will show different aspects of the buildings and some of the different houses. I've done some programs before for Lake Forest Library and Lake Forest Historical Society, and those programs focus primarily on Lake Forest buildings. But tonight, as I said, we're going to look at Libertyville and Mundelein. We're also going to go up and look at Temple Farm, which was built for the Jelke family. And a lot of the farms we have were built in areas that weren't annexed to anything. So a lot of these, I kind of don't know where the address is in some of the cases. So here we go. I want to start and introduce our architects to you. In the center is Stanley Anderson, about 1946. Stanley was born in Lake Forest, attended Lake Forest College, and then he got his bachelor's degree there, and then attended the University of Illinois for their architecture program. And later, during World War I, he attended the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And on the right is his pre-World War II partner, Jim Tickner. Jim was from Peoria and met Stanley at the University of Illinois. They both served together in World War I, and he left the firm in about 1940, 1941. On the left is my dad, Bill Bergmann. He joined the firm in 1946 after the war, and he's a generation younger than Anderson. He received his architecture degree from the University of Minnesota, and just for context, Anderson is 22 years older than my dad. So as we get started here, I want to give you a little direction as where we're going. I'm trying to break the program down into a number of parts so that you can sort of follow the transition that the firm goes through. I'm not going to show you all 15 chapters in the book. We don't have enough time for that. There's always more Anderson work. The firm was very prolific. So we're going to take a look at the English Village in the 1920s. Then we're going to spend a lot of time looking at the Country Georgian era with a quick little stop at Lake Forest High School. And then, as I say, we're going to go up to the Hunt Country, and then we'll get into showing more of the Bill Bergmann years. So first we start out with the English Village. And in 1919, Stanley came home from World War I, and he went to work for a very important architect named Howard Van Doren Shaw. He had an office in Chicago and lived in Lake Forest. Anderson grew up in Lake Forest and was quite familiar with Shaw's Market Square, which was built from 1912 to about 1916. And what Stanley wanted to do, following on Shaw's work, was he wanted to build, and he wanted to expand Shaw's concept of an English building, an English village. In 5 years, from 1925 to 1930, Stanley greatly expanded and enlarged Shaw's concept of a city beautiful style village in Lake Forest with his own village concept. So this is the Anderson Hall, which the Anderson family had built. This was built in about 1905. The family ran a dry goods store. It's the long row of windows that you see in the center left of the photograph. The family dry goods store was on the first floor, and the second floor was vacant and was open for, it was big open space for town meetings and dances and whatnot. Anderson's father, Will, ran the dry goods store. The other thing I want you to see in this photograph, this postcard, is the higgledy-piggledy collection of storefronts. And this is typical in Lake Forest, it's typical in Lake Bluff, and it's typical in Libertyville at the same time. And Anderson wanted to change this. He wanted Lake Forest to look like a large, prosperous English village from about the 1820s or 1830s. And he wanted to do this with a collection of Tudor and Georgian buildings. And so here's a headline from the Chicago Tribune from 1926. And it says, like a bit a high street in some Yorkshire village. And the article then goes on to explain the whole English village concept. And in 5 years' time, Stanley was going to build a whole series of buildings. He wanted to connect, if you know Lake Forest at all, well, he wanted to connect the Deer Path Inn, which is on the south side of the business district, to Market Square, which is more or less in the center of the business district. Surprisingly, Anderson tried to do the same thing in Libertyville at the same time. And we're going to talk about the Bartholomew building in just a few minutes. So I want to show you this building. This is the first building that they built. It's called the East of Theater Building. And this is done in a Georgian style. And so he's trying to make this prosperous English village. And I want you to pay a close attention to the shape and the form of this building. It's a two-story Georgian building with stores on the first floor, apartments on the second floor. And then I want you to take a look at the door case that's here. I want you to notice the triangular door hood over the door case, and below it is a fan light, that curved arched light, and then a very formal panel door. On either side of the door are these engaged columns. They're half-round columns with capitals on top. And so right next to this building is the Deer Path Theater building. And this visually connects all of this stuff, all of this English village stuff together. The Deer Path Inn is a block south, Market Square is a block north, and this really forms the basis for a street in Lake Forest called Bank Lane, becoming the connector street for all of these buildings. And so this is right next to the East of Theater building. And if we take a look, here's the inside of the theater. I don't know if any of you spend any Saturday, I don't know if there's anybody old enough here to have spent Saturday mornings in here as a kid watching movies, or later spent Saturday night date night in this theater. I know I did an awful lot of socializing here as a teenager. Sadly, this interior was gutted in the 1980s. So now we're going to jump and run up a little bit north to Lake Bluff. And I want to show you the Griffith Building, which is also built in 1925. And here's another two-story brick Georgian building with stores on the first floor and apartments on the second floor. Just down the street from this, just west of this, is the Stanley Building, done in an English Tudor building style. And here we see this Georgian style, Tudor style, Georgian style, Tudor style going back and forth and back and forth. And so if we go and take a look at the main door case for that building, here once again we see this pyramidal form. We see the columns, the pilasters on either side, and we see this lovely fan light that's done over the top of the door. So you can see that there's two examples of this. And now we get to the Bartholomew Building in Libertyville. This building is on Milwaukee Avenue at Broadway, and there's a park just to the south of this. This is designed by Anderson in 1929, which is several years later than the East of Theater building in Lake Forest or the Griffith building in Lake Bluff. And note, once again, it's another two-story Georgian brick building with stores on the first floor and apartments on the second floor. Now, if we turn our view just a little bit, here we come across the Public Services Building built in 1928, just a year before the Bartholomew Building. And what's exciting about the location of the Public Services Building is it's just north of the Bartholomew Building. It's this exuberant Tudor style building. It's got this fabulous clock tower. It has a corner tower. And Anderson would have built the Bartholomew Building in the English village style of mixing Georgian and Tudor buildings together. And so here's a reverse view of it. The camera position doesn't change from taking the photograph you just saw to this photograph. It gives you an idea how close together these two buildings are. So now here we get a close-up of the door. And this is the door that goes to the vestibule for the apartments upstairs. And this is very special as Anderson is using the same classical door motif as the East of Theater building and the Griffith buildings. But this is the best of all three. And so I want to give you this really tight close-up shot so that you can take a look at all of the beautiful stonework in this. The other two doors you've seen so far were made out of wood. This one's made out of stone. It's embellished with engaged columns and triglyphs. The little, you can see the three straight lines that are up and down. Those are called triglyphs. Those are ancient Greek architectural forms. And this is part of this wonderful detail work that you see on this door. And then again, this wonderful laced mullion fan light. And this is something that people in Libertyville can be really proud of. This is a really, really nice building. And so we're going to leave the English Georgian bit a little bit. I won't get you into as many details for a while, but I did want you to see the wonderful details on the Bartholomew building. And now we're going to sort of move around a little bit and look at some other pre-Depression style buildings. This is the Stanley McKean building and the Paxton building, the Paxton House. One is in Waukegan, the other is in Hammond, Indiana. The Stanley McKean House on the top is interesting in that Charles Staley was president of the biggest bank in Waukegan, called the State Bank at the time. The house was under construction in October 1929 when the Depression hit. He was wiped out and walked away from the unfinished house. Dr. McKean was an oral surgeon and took the house project over. And in the middle of the Depression, his clients had cash to pay for their oral surgery, so he had the money to pay for the house. And the house below that is the house for Mrs. Paxton in Hammond, Indiana. She was the widow of a very successful lumber merchant and banker. And the house you see in front of you is all one house. I was recently asked if that was two houses, if the mass over on the left was a second house. No, that's all one house. It's connected. Two more houses. The upper house is the E.E. Tolman House in Ivanhoe, Illinois. Stanley and his cousin James Anderson, who was a civil engineer, designed a 9-hole golf course on this 200-acre property. The course is now part of the Ivanhoe Country Club, or Ivanhoe Golf Club. And below that is the Frank Hibbard House. This is built on the 10th green of Shore Acres Country Club in Lake Bluff. And the house is called Out of Bounds, as it's on the 10th green on the golf course. Hibbard was president of Hibbard, Spencer, and Bartlett, who were hardware wholesalers that later became True Value hardware stores. We then get to the James Lovell House. This is built in 1928. This is a French Norman style house. French Norman is a sort of a cousin style to English Tudor. And I want you to see the gate in the middle of the picture. I always think of French Norman as being a little bit more rounded and a bit more romantic in styling than English Tudor. But I'm going to take you through that gate now. And here we are, we're just peeking through the gate. So inside the wooden gate is an iron gate. And also notice the beautiful stair tower. French Norman houses are country houses and tend to be fortresses as well as elegant homes. And they have to be fortresses because they're out in the French countryside, and you have to guard against robbers and highwaymen and other villains that might be around. So now we're going to take a look at the living room. This house has a galleried living room, and I want to show you the lower view, and you can see the huge trusses and all the wonderful woodwork in the ceiling. And then here's the gallery view. This is a reverse view looking through the gallery and trusses and down onto the first floor. I have a 1920s book from the Anderson Library that describes how to make French truss work. Stanley was always looking for the most appropriate and most authentic way to complete his houses. And if he was going to build a French house, he'd want a book on French truss work. And then here is the, as we're leaving the Lovell house now, this is a look at the wrought iron grill in the front door. And this follows the theme that the house is both a palace and a fortress. So now we move a little bit into the Country Georgian era. The English village era died with a bang. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and the world changed forever at that point. The English cottage styles and the French Norman that we've just seen died out in popularity completely. It was just simply the end of that style. And this is the first of Anderson's most well-known country Georgian buildings. This is the First National Bank. It's on Deer Path in downtown Lake Forest. It's now the Northern Trust Bank. And the building is high formal in Georgian style. And it's part of the English village that I just showed you. The Deer Path Theater is directly across the street from this. The Deer Path Inn is a block down behind the building, sort of off to your right. And while we're here, I want you to notice the triangular form on the face of the bank. For non-architects in the audience, this is called a pediment in architectural terms. And we've seen this shape once or twice. We're going to see it throughout the rest of this program. And so here are two pictures. One is the banking room, the main banking lobby, and then a trip down to see the wrought iron gates in the vault area. And I guess I may be a little bit old fashioned, but when I'm in downtown Lake Forest, I always try to do my banking in the lobby room just because I like walking into this room. It's such an elegant room. The oak paneling that you see was originally done in a warm sort of middle brown color. And then in the early 2000s, the Northern Trust actually painted this room. If you're ever in Lake Forest, and if the Northern Trust ever opens the lobby up again, if you're in the bank, go down the stairs and take a look at this just magnificent wrought iron work. It's really, really fun to take a look at. And then in 1962, my dad added the center addition onto the bank. He added it was originally 2 floors, then he added a 3rd floor in 1968. This is a mid-century modern style of architecture. And then a 3rd section was then added, as you see on the left. So then this takes us to King Brevard. And King Brevard is, it was in Hinsdale. Again, it was built in an unincorporated area, which then turned into Burr Ridge. And this is Stanley's second monumental country Georgian property. It is probably his most significant and most important building that he built. As the Depression closed in, the Georgian architecture style became very popular, and it is King Brevard that's the design base and refinement for Stanley's extraordinarily popular country Georgian style. Suzanne King Brevard died in 1928, and she left an extensive trust fund, approximately $4 million in 1928 dollars. It's probably 30 or 40 million dollars in today's money, to build and endow a retirement home for elderly women. Now, her endowment built this 80-room retirement home, and as the Chicago Tribune's send-up headline reads, for spinsters of gentle birth and good breeding. And that's sort of the Tribune making fun of all of this. But the will actually reads that the home is to be open for women over the age of 60, widow or unmarried, and without funds. So that means if you were a woman and accepted into this facility, you would live here for free for the rest of your life. And so here's the front facade. It was begun in 1932 at the very bottom of the Depression. And you can see this very formal temple front. You can see the triangular pediment over the entrance. And I want you to notice the oculus window and the small dormers. This is part of the highly developed scale that the firm used. And this is just a huge facility, but it doesn't look overpowering. You like the size of the building because it's appropriately scaled. Now, this is a little closer look at the front of the house. And here you get a better view of the oculus and pediment. And I want you to notice the swan's neck scroll over the front door. Anderson, Tickner, my dad, Bill Bergmann, and the draftsmen in the firm would describe Country Georgian as what we might classify as American colonial, federal, Georgian, or Regency in design. And all of these forms would fit into their definition of Country Georgian. They understood that they were mixing a lot of designs with their phrase Country Georgian. Now here's a side view of the building to give you a sense of the size of the building. And I want you to notice the different types of wall designs. On your left, you see stone, then brick in sort of the center, and then over to the right, you see stone down below and shingles up above. And this gives the impression that it's all sorts of different kinds of buildings that have been built at different times, when in fact, this is all one building. It's all built at the same time. And this is the part of the Country Georgian style of mixing all of these pieces together and making it all come together in this lovely whole. And this is now a co-ed facility. I'm told it has one of the finest memory care units in the country there. So both either men or women. And the trust fund is still there supporting people. There's so many payment systems today, but there is a substantial trust fund for funding people who don't have those kinds of assets. So here's a picture of our girl. This is Suzanne King Brevard. When she was a debutante in the 1880s, she was known for her exquisite and very stylish clothing. Her Titian red hair is always mentioned when describing her as one of the most beautiful debutantes of the time. She married Edmond Brevard, a French diplomat, after meeting him at the 1893 Columbian exhibition. And the wind vane you see was designed by Anderson and is part of his whimsy. He is gently chiding Suzanne's high-style dress with a hoop skirt and then showing off her love of corgi dogs. So as we go inside the facility, here's a view of the dining room, and you can see this is a huge room. It has monumental cornices and pediments, and these are all details that come from the early Georgian period. And here you can see the fireplace overmantel, and notice the swan's neck scroll over the fireplace. It matches the swan's neck scroll at the front door. Mrs. Magoon, the English house mistress, ran King Brevard in the 1930s and 40s. She ran a very formal household. She required that all women coming down to dine must be fully dressed in skirt, heels, and makeup. If residents didn't want to dress, they would be served in their rooms. And so here is the great room at King Brevard. It's paneled in pine. You can see this lovely truss ceiling and the monumental fireplace. Mrs. Magoon had a house rule that no male visitors were allowed above the first floor. And here we are out back in the porches and the upper garden. At the back of the building is this very large formal parterre garden with a reflecting pool. And notice the two-story sleeping porches just below the pediment. I went to a reception here, and this is just the most elegant garden to stand in and enjoy being in a big facility like this. So as we leave King Brevard, I wanted you to take a look at the detail of the wrought iron work. This is a wrought iron fence down in the garden, and I thought you would be pleased to see that.
Paul, can I interrupt you for just a second? We had a question about the previous house, and I thought it might be easier to answer it in place.
Yes.
The person is asking, is the red brick on the outside, has it been painted white?
So the house, the King Brevard was originally painted white. It was painted a rather glossy white paint. With all of the beautiful brickwork underneath it, the current management of the King Brevard facility, the trustees, doesn't believe that brick should be painted. So they have purposefully not painted the building in about 15 years. And so there's sort of two different sides to the question of do we or don't we paint the brick? And I have told the trustees it was originally supposed to be painted. And they said, we kind of don't care. We want to see the original red brick. What's lovely about the building is there is such beautiful brick underneath the paint. So that's the lovely part. So then getting back to the Walter Wecker house, this is house done in 1935. This is in Bannockburn. It sits on 7.5 acres. And Walter Wecker was the head of the Marquette Cement Company. And during the 30s and 40s, he expanded the company to a major cement dealer all across the upper Midwest. This is a James Tickner house. Tickner worked on this house his entire career. He first designed it in 1935 and then proceeded to remodel the house for another 40 years. As we go inside, this is the central hallway. The door on the right is the living room, and on the left is the stairwell, and directly ahead is the dining room. And here's the living room. And you can notice the fine paneled wall surrounding the fireplace. It has hand-carved linen fold panels in it. And on the left is a door to the garden. On the right is this very cozy window seat. There's a radiator right underneath the window seat. So this must be really nice and warm and cozy on a winter's day. And then here's two outside views of the house. Mrs. Wecker had extensive gardens, and according to some of the articles, she had several acres of rose gardens. And on the left is the greenhouse, and on the right is her tea garden. Tickner designed the tea garden so that it is directly across the lawn from the house, and Mrs. Tickner can look out her bedroom window and see this garden. Every morning when she gets up, she can look out and see her tea garden. We then get to the Paul McBride house, another house done in the 1930s. Paul McBride was an investment banker and a bond broker. He's one of the bond brokers that financed the growth of the city of Chicago. And so I wanted to give you a picture of the chimney. The firm really prided itself on its masonry work. They only hired the best masons in the area and then demanded the best work out of the masons. And if you want to spend a lot of money on your house, tell your mason that you want a window in the chimney. Not only the window, but I want you to also look at the carved stone brackets that are on the same level as the window also. And then you can see there's our little pediment form above the second floor window. So now that I've shown you the chimney, I'll show you the fireplace that's connected to it. And so you can see all of the wonderful cornice work up at the ceiling line and this great big magnificent fireplace and lovely mantle. And then here we are taking a peek in the dining room. And you can see the lovely corner hutch cabinet that's there. So now we come to Stanley's third monumental project, Lake Forest High School. And there are literally thousands of Lake Forest High School alumni that know that they graduated from a very special school. In 2017, Architectural Digest declared Lake Forest High School to be the prettiest high school in Illinois. And every part of this building is drawn in exacting detail. I have over 100 drawings of all of the details that go into building this school. This is the main entrance that you see, the front door to the school, and you can see the front door drawing. This was done in its final form. It was done with an India ink pen on linen drawing paper, on honest to gosh cloth drawing paper. So I have some drawings in the collection that are 4 feet wide and 8 and 10 feet tall to get all of the details put together for this building. So I hope many of you, although you're in Libertyville and Mundelein, I hope many of you are in Lake Forest from time to time and have seen the high school, because one of the local trivia questions is, how many chimneys does the building have? And I didn't realize this was a local trivia question until somebody stopped me one day and said, have you been to the Historical Society's program where they asked this as a trivia question? There's a number of ways to answer the question. If you count the stacks without flutes and then add all of the flutes or the chimney pots together, you can arrive at 34 chimneys on top of the building. Now, what makes this really amusing is that there's only one chimney in this entire group that works. There is a fireplace in the library. I'm going to show it to you in a minute. There's a fireplace in the library there was an actual wood burning fireplace. All the rest of these are just for show. So here we are. This is the library. And over on the right, you can see the fireplace. Up until 1957, it was a working fireplace. You could go in and study. You could go in and study your algebra while keeping your feet warm around the fire, which I find a little incongruous, but that was the case. In 1957, they remodeled the school and patched up the chimneys and then closed off this particular fireplace. I also want you to look at the double doors over on the left, and I want you to look at the urn that's above the double doors. And so this is a hand-carved urn that was placed in the woodwork at the school. The detail drawing, which I have in my collection, gives the exact details on how the urn is to be executed. And so I have this rendering that's framed, and here you can see the lovely urn that sits in the library. So here we are. We're going to say goodbye to Lake Forest High School, and here's the entire building. It's the entire building that was done by Stanley Anderson and my dad. The wing you see, the pediment form you see all the way over on the right, was added to the high school by my dad in 1960. And so this is the entire building. It's actually grown beyond this over time. But what's important about looking at this is 1935, and this is the WPA project. And then we get to 1938 and another WPA project. This is Central School in Libertyville. And you can see some similarities between the high school and the grade school. Both of them are Georgian style schools. This was a public grade school for many years. Then it was a private school. And the building has now been adaptively repurposed into condominiums. And you can see the lovely, sort of wonderfully starchy style of the Georgian style. Here we take a much closer look at the front door. Like the Bartholomew building, it's monumental with its pedimented door hood and fluted columns. You can see this is just a magnificent entrance to the building. And then our last look is a close-up of the cupola sitting on top of the roof. A cupola is typically used to ventilate an attic space. And in some situations where the louvers are replaced with glass, it then is lit and becomes known as a lantern. But this is this wonderfully scaled and wonderfully shaped cupola. So now we're going to take our trip out to the Hunt Country. So it's all, we're off to go fox hunting and tally ho. So the firm built approximately 25 or 30 farms over its career. This was a big part of the romance of the firm. And many of the horse farms were built in Libertyville and Mundelein and the surrounding countryside. Many of the addresses drawn on the drawings will say near Mundelein or near Libertyville without much indication beyond where that is. And that's where my work with Jenny comes in and is so important. But here you see the blood sport of fox hunting. Like foresters were always horse people. The original Onwensia Club was located in Westlake Forest, stretching along Waukegan Road. And Austin Black, master of the hunt, had a farm and kept several packs of hunting dogs there. In the 1920s, the North Shore Electric Line built a rail line through this area and pushed the hunt out of Lake Forest. They all moved north and west to Millburn. There they bought 200 and 300 acre farms and enjoyed fox hunting, horse breeding, and living the good life. And you can see this today. If you go to Gurney Mills Shopping Center, the main crossroad there is Hunt Club Road, and for good reason. If you go about 2 miles north, you'll see the Hunt Club, which is designed by David Adler about 1935. And Stanley Anderson filled in the whole area around the Hunt Club with upscale horse farms and fancy stables. And so this is Good Luck. This is the weekend house for the Jelke family. In 1929, John Jelke Jr. commissioned Anderson to outfit a horse farm for him. Jelke owned Good Luck Margarine, the largest selling brand of margarine in the United States at the time. Some of you may recognize the house as it is part of Temple Farm. Now this is the weekend house. It sits on a man-made hill that's approximately 40 feet high and was used on weekends and for parties, as the Jelkes had a big house in Lake Forest. In the 1970s, my dad and I converted what you see as the garage. We added the garage and converted the existing garage into a serving kitchen for caterers. It's not a cooking kitchen, it's a caterer's kitchen. So at the same time Anderson was building this farm, he was building 4 other farms within about a 4-mile radius of the Jelke farm. This included Dixfield for the A.B. Dick family and the R. Douglas Stewart farm. And they would continue building stables in this area for decades. So now we get to the front of the stable. And this is facing the main house. As you can see, it's down the hill. And on the left, you can see the apple orchard. When my dad was out here in the 1970s, he got into trouble with the Austrian riding trainers for picking apples and feeding them to the horses. As he was told, horses are very jealous animals, and they could smell that one horse got an apple when others didn't. And he was told that he would either have to feed apples to all the horses or none of them. So that was in order to keep peace in the stable. So this is a rear view of the stable. This stable is designed with angled wings so that groups of horses can be held in secluded areas. Since horses are very social animals, you don't want the whole group together. It's best to keep them in smaller groups. And this is a stable, it's not a barn. It only houses horses. There's no cattle and no dairy here. And the Jelkes were riders and did very little farming. Some of the other people out here did extensive farming. And this is the main entrance to the stable. And as we go inside, here's a montage of the views of the stable. One, you can see this beautiful white Lipizzan horse. The stable will hold approximately 40 horses when filled to capacity. You can see the long hallways leading to the groups of box stalls. And notice also the ironwork on tops of the stalls. The ornate work is typical of the firm stable. And also notice the crosshatch floors cross hatching is to provide traction for the horse's iron hooves. This is the tack room. And the tack room is where the saddles and bridles and riding gear is stored. And for people, this can be in a very important room at the stable. Often it's the only room that's heated, so that can be important. But all the tack must be cleaned and oiled after each time it's used. And so then, if you haven't been out to see the Temple Lipizzans, I encourage everybody to go see the horse show. Rather than fox hunting, Good Luck is now the center of the Lipizzan horse training for Temple Farms. And here's a number of views of these magnificent animals. In the two upper pictures, the horses are performing what's called the corbeille, which is one of the airs above ground. And it is with 4 legs in the air and a mounted rider. And the horse on the lower left is performing a stylized prancing walk. The house in the background of that is not a Stanley Anderson house, it's the White House. And the Temple Lipizzans performed for both of the Nixon inaugurations. And at the lower right shows that the Lipizzans are born black and turn white with age. And so kind of like the rest of us, we all seem to turn white with age. So getting a little closer to home for Libertyville-Mundelein, this is the John Denby Allen Farm. Allen was president of the Brinks Armored Car Company, and he built a 600-acre cattle and horse farm at the southwest corner of Milwaukee Road and Route 60. The main house and stable were located a little south and a little west of where Walmart is today. So if you know the shopping center, I guess that's actually in Vernon Hills, to be geographically correct. But this farm, the farm buildings were on a gentle rise sort of behind where Walmart is today. Allen's farm supplied fresh milk to stores in Libertyville. And this is the Wells Ranny Farm. This is out on Casey Road. The Wells family is from Lake Forest and bought this farm in 1935. Anderson heavily remodeled it and revised this farmhouse. The Wells family bought the farm primarily for the enjoyment of their twin boys, and they doted on these 2 twin boys. However, much to the family's chagrin, they discovered that the twins had such bad hay fever, they couldn't visit the farm. And I talked to Don Wells, one of the boys. He was in his 80s when I talked to him. He said they got such bad hay fever by coming out to the farm that his mother would have to put them in bed after they'd been at the farm for no more than 4 or 5 hours. So the family quickly sold the farm after that, about 1937 or 1938, they sold the farm. So here's a picture of the stable that Anderson added to the barn. He added the stable and also greatly expanded the barn. And the farm had dairy and beef cattle along with a very extensive chicken coop. And then in 1945, the George Ranny Sr. family bought the farm. Now, the Rannys had horses, but they weren't so interested in animals, so they tended to raise corn and hay for sale. And George Ranny told me, I went and interviewed him, he said that he and his wife knew they were going to buy the farm as soon as they saw the stable. They said they just fell in love with the place right there on the spot. And in Mr. Ranny's later years, he was more interested in creating a bird sanctuary and pond from the small stream that runs through the property. Another building that they did was the stable at the Ed Lake Stevenson property. This is open to the public. You can see this. I think it's open 7 days a week for just a drive-through, but I think you have to check a calendar for when they have the house open and have the stable open. But Adlai Stevenson had a small farm on St. Mary's Road, and he built this combination building that consists of a 3-stall stable, the machine tool barn, multi-car garage, and caretaker's cottage. The building is designed in an Art Deco style to mimic the first house that was on the property. Stevenson's house burned shortly after this building was completed, and the house there today is the replacement house that is built after this stable is built. And Anderson did a great many of these small stable barn buildings throughout Libertyville and Mundelein and sort of the greater area. And unfortunately, many haven't survived as land uses have changed. Now, since Jenny asked that this program be specific to Libertyville and Mundelein, I'm now going to show you the scale craft houses. These are not in my book, but there's this just wonderfully interesting story. Anderson built a small group of houses during World War II to assist in the war effort. Elliott Donnelly, a Lake Forester, in 1939-1940 owned the Scalecraft Company. Scalecraft built model working trains. These are not the Lionel trains that many of us played with as kids. Rather, they are about 8 or 10 inches tall, 1 or 2 feet long, and they are working steam locomotives that came in pieces. The hobbyist, not a small child, a hobbyist, somebody who could work with their hands, would build the locomotive, lay the tracks, build extra rail cars, and then would actually fire up this locomotive with coal or perhaps oil, fill a boiler full of water, and the steam engine would actually work. These were custom made and very expensive adult toys. At the outbreak of World War II, the federal government came to Donnelly and said it was going to nationalize his company for top secret war work. They explained to him they wanted him to start building parts of the top secret Norden bomb site. This bomb site was in every single bomber that went over Germany. Now, since he had a shop full of highly trained machinists, they wanted his shop to make parts for the bomb site. And at the beginning of the war, the Norden bomb site was as highly classified as the Manhattan Project, the nuclear bomb project. The US was desperate for war production in 1942 and went to extreme lengths to get the war materials it needed. When Donnelly demurred to the FBI agents and said they didn't want his machinists, as many of them were German or Czechoslovakian nationals, the FBI responded that they already knew about the German nationals and that the German nationals would all be designated US citizens the following week. So when they nationalized the plant, they placed a crew of government managers in the plant to supervise the manufacturing. And Anderson built 8 of these very small cottages on Coolidge Avenue. And Donnelly commissioned these, and 8 of them were built, 6 of them survive today. So here are the first 2. Here are the second 2. And you can see these are very, very small cottages. The white cottage on the top is one of the larger cottages. It was actually a 4-bedroom cottage. All of the other cottages are either 2-bedroom, and I think in one of the cases, it was actually a 1-bedroom cottage. So here's the 3rd and 4th, and here's the 5th and 6th cottages. The one down below, the white cottage down below is, I think, also a 4-bedroom cottage. But what's unique is that these were all part of Libertyville's contribution to the war effort. And many of these have had additions put on them in one form or another. And unfortunately, many have lost many of their Anderson details. But this delightful little neighborhood still exists on Coolidge Avenue. So we shift gears a little bit, At the end of World War II, Anderson came home from the Navy to reopen his office. Anderson had been a lieutenant in the Army in World War I, and he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy in World War II. Thus, he is a two-war and two services veteran of the service. So Tickner had moved on, set up his own practice in Glencoe, and Anderson hired Bill Bergmann to help him design the new flow of business coming into the office. When Bergmann arrived, he had a very strong taste for the new mid-century modern style that was taking over, the Mies van der Rohe styling. He built Robertson's clothing store in 1954. This supported a very wide clientele of Lake Forest. Not only did the very, very, very fancy folk in Lake Forest shop here, but all the rest of us shop there also. And notice the mixture of stone columns and brick veneer in putting the building together. This is the interior and exterior of the store, a nice night shot of what it looked like when the windows were illuminated. George Robertson would keep his store open on major event nights. So if the Anwensia Club was having a big do or it was prom night, he would stay open late in case someone had an emergency of some sort. So he would keep his shop open just to cater to his clientele. So at the same time, he's building, Bill Bergmann is building a number of houses. This is the Edward Sims house in Lake Bluff. This is a mid-century modern style house. It's built at the intersection of two ravines. And it was one of his favorites, one of Bergmann's favorite houses, as it followed so much of the mid-century modern ethos. And the house was designed for a dedicated amateur classical musician. It has very high ceilings for better classical music acoustics. And the owner hosted Mozart and Beethoven quartets on a regular basis. I remember attending some of those as a youngster. And you can see the living room is mid-century modern simple. There are no cornices, no details, no fireplace mantle. The only ornamentation in the room are the redwood beams and the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. And here's a reverse view of the room. And even though it's on a heavily wooded lot, it still has lots of sunshine coming into this house. So also at the same time, Bergmann is designing this house for Mrs. Huntington Henry and her daughter. This is a French provincial house. It has a very high level of classical French detailing. It's a small jewel of a house. It sits on almost 2 acres, but it is intentionally small to mimic the small urban 18th century houses found in the environs around Versailles. And so if we go through that front door you see in front of you, we get to the main stair. And this is Bill Bergmann's take on a spiral stair. And I want you to look at the detail in the wrought iron stair rail. Bergmann studied French architectural details for several months before beginning design on this house. And then here's a detail of the wrought iron work. The wrought iron balusters are all handmade and all based on French patterns. And here's a view of the living room. And notice all the moldings, the panel moldings and cornices are all cast in place plaster moldings. This is a very expensive and almost lost construction technique. And notice all the color in the room. The owner had a wonderful flamboyant sense of styling. And we're going to take a quick peek in the kitchen. How is this for a cheery room? The tiles were all collected in France by the owner. They're all hand painted. And so to not disappoint the Mundelein members of our audience tonight, this is the first congregational church in Mundelein. It is now the Community Protestant Church. And it was done just after World War II. My dad joined Anderson and became his post-World War II partner. In the 1940s, they built a series of churches in Waukegan, Mundelein, and Lake Forest. And they built the first Congregational church in 1946. And as I said, it's now been renamed. So here's one view of it. Here's a second view of it. And we can see the original Sunday school end of the building and chancel building. The church is located at Prairie and Hawley Streets. And at the time, when you look in the background, there's no other buildings out here. So it's kind of fun to see how the area has developed over time. And just as we leave, notice our friend, the triangular pediment that we see on the building. And here are two views of the narthex. This is a very inviting church to go into. This room is just a warm, comforting, welcoming room. If you like going to churches, if you like visiting churches, this is a very fun place to visit because it's a very nice building. And here in the chancel, you can see the wonderful scaling and the wonderful detail. I went to church here several years ago and had just a wonderful church service here. This is a very warm and comfortable and welcoming church to attend. So in 1960, Stanley Anderson dies. He had a massive heart attack and passed away at age 65. The firm's name was changed to Stanley D. Anderson Associates, and Bill Bergmann took over as a principal architect. And the firm went on for another 30 years. And at the time Stanley passed away, Bill Bergmann was working on what's known as the 580 Bank Lane building. And this was considered the largest building in Lake Forest since Market Square was built in 1916. And it's Bergmann's largest and most decidedly mid-century modern building. And it was controversial when it was built in 1960 because people thought it was too modern. It was too fancy. And conservative Lake Foresters thought something else might be more appropriate. And this is along the way, this is along Bank Lane. So this is part of where Anderson's concept 30 years before had been to connect the Deer Path Inn, which would be behind us, to Market Square, which would be ahead of us in this photograph. And he tried to maintain a lovely sidewalk with trees and little bits of lawn and bushes. And so he's trying to maintain the English village concept from the 1920s. And then to look at a couple of houses, we have two houses left here to take a look at. This is the Cudahy house, done in 1965. This is a Country Georgian style house. It's a very understated house, but notice that it is Palladian in design. It has a center mass and two flanking wings on either side of it. At this point, Bergmann is trying to mix modern, mid-century modern aesthetic with the older classical designs of Palladio and other forms of classicism. So as we get to the front door, this is a very formal but very simple front door. With modernism, there's very little interest in heavy detailing, which Bergmann omitted here. The interior is going to be much more ornate. So here we get to the living room. Again, you can see this is just a wonderfully scaled room. It has lovely cornices and nice big windows and French doors in it. And then we take a look at the fireplace. You can see that the moldings are very ornate, much more ornate than the exterior trim would tend to indicate. We have heavier cornices and lots of casework. And so our last house is the Sewell and Shirley Gardner House. This is done in 1969, 1970. Bergmann and the Gardners called this house their California Modern House. The windows were custom made in California and were the largest thermopane windows available at the time. And so that's where the California nickname came from. But as with other houses of the era, the exteriors might be simple, but the interiors are still lovely with lovely detail work. So this is the exterior. Here is the central stair. Mrs. Gardner was Mrs. Shirley Keith Gardner. Her stepmother was Mrs. Stanley Keith. Mrs. Stanley Keith was also known as Mrs. Kersey Coates Reed from an earlier marriage. Mrs. Reed Keith had a house designed by David Adler on Lake Road in Lake Forest. It's a very famous house. It's an enormous house. It's done in gray stone. It looks prominently out over Lake Michigan, and it's probably one of the biggest houses that Adler did. Famously, Mrs. Reed Keith's house has Steuben glass balusters in the stairwell for her spiral stair. So her daughter, her stepdaughter, as an homage, Mrs. Gardner used lucite balusters in her stair. So the stair you're looking at now, those are lucite balusters that are holding up the stair rail. And as you look at this, you can see when how the light hits the rails can actually disappear from your view, and it looks like the handrails are literally floating in space. And so this was Mrs. Gardner's claim to being part of the modern era. And so here's our final view of the house. We're in the living room. Once again, a nice, lovely room, beautiful proportions, nice, lovely bookcase. In the arch over the green bookcase you see are hidden speakers for amplifying music in the room. And one last point, notice the draperies. The drapes are hung in wall pockets, and the drapes are hung on motorized rods. So if you pushed a rod, or excuse me, if you pushed a button, the draperies would ride along a rod and open and close. And on the outside of the house, there are window awnings on each of these windows, and they too are motorized. And so there's a great deal of 1970s modernism. We kind of chuckle at that today, but that's what they thought was really neat in the era. So that's my program for all of you. I hope I've given you a bit of a look of some things in Libertyville. We have a nice church in Mundelein. We took a trip out to the horse country and looked at some of the things out there. And I hope you've also just had fun looking at some awfully pretty houses too. So that's the end of my program. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions. And thank you very much for hosting me in this program.
Thank you so much, Paul. Say that again, unmuted. Still muted. Okay, there we go. So we do have two questions in the Q&A. One is, do you know when the Allen Farm was destroyed? In 1960, at the southwest corner of Route 60 in Milwaukee, there were many chicken coops representing Continental eggs, thus the nomenclature on the entryway to Continental Executive Park. So I guess the question is, do you know when the Allen Farm was taken down?
We could go back and get a sense of when the shopping centers went in. So I too remember the chicken coops being out there in the sort of early 1970s. And then I think that southwest corner of the intersection went into shopping center development in about 1985 or so, 1980. I'm not entirely sure when it went into complete development.
I don't know off the top of my head either. I have in my head like late 80s. We could definitely look into that and let you know.
Yeah, that might be a fun thing to check on. I continue to hope that somebody's going to say, oh, and I have a whole collection of photographs of the place, because the drawings I have of the Allen farm are just as spectacular as everything I showed you at the Jelke farm. And there's another farm out in the Hunt country called Dixfield that's even more, it's even fancier. So if someone can come up with some photographs, I'd be eternally grateful for that. So
I have one other question before I ask it, though. I wanted to let people know I did post a link to the Stevenson home into the chat, a link to the webpage that talks about when you can visit it and how to go about visiting it. And I also just posted a link. I talked about the Historical Society doing a docent-led tour this year. Last year, we launched an online self-guided tour of 40 buildings in the downtown area, one of which is the Bartholomew building. So I've posted a link to the tour entry for the Bartholomew building if people want to see some older photographs of it. We do have one person in the chat said, I moved to Mundelein in 1986 and the shopping areas were cornfields, and she does not have any photos.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, sure. She moved to Mundelein in 1986 and the shopping areas were still cornfields, and she does not have any photos.
Okay, all right.
The one other question we have in the Q&A is, Anderson passed a year after Frank Lloyd Wright did. Did their paths ever cross, or did they collaborate on any projects?
Oh, you've asked a very fun question. Yes, the firm had some very, very sharp views about Mr. Wright. Okay. And so Stanley, so I showed you King Brevard. And see if I can still back up on this thing. I showed you King Brevard. Oops, I've blown everything up here. So I showed you King Brevard property. That was built by the executrix of the estate was Mrs. Nora Burry. Mrs. Nora Burry was very interested in architecture, and she knew Frank Lloyd Wright. She invited Frank Lloyd Wright to dinner at their Stanley Anderson designed house. They lived in a very formal stone house in Lake Forest. It's every bit as formal as King Brevard. It's, you know, the socks are starched, you know, everything is starched. And so Frank Lloyd Wright shows up a couple hours late for dinner. He drives in his bright yellow Studs Bearcat convertible. He's got a whole entourage of his people with him. He gets out of the car, throws his cape over his shoulder and says, Nora, why don't you let me design a house for you and I'll take you out of this doll's house. Well, the Burrys were horrified to have their house called a doll house. They loved classical architecture. And while they admired Frank Lloyd Wright for his reputation, they thought he was kind of a nutcase, and they weren't about to commission him to build anything for them. So Stanley and Mrs. Burry laughed about the dollhouse joke for a generation. That was always part of the fun of their friendship, was talking about, let me take you out of this dollhouse. And so they were classicists. They believed in Georgian architecture and formal architecture and architecture that followed the revivalist styles. So they weren't, while they studied and knew a great deal, they watched Frank Lloyd Wright very carefully. They weren't very much interested in emulating his work. So no, they did not collaborate together.
All righty, those were the outstanding questions that we had in the Q&A. I don't think I missed any in the chat. Let me just double check.
Okay, anybody else with any comments?
Saw a couple of thank yous for the wonderful program. I'll look at these buildings differently in the future.
Good.
All right, I'm not seeing anything showing up in the chat. I'll just give it a little bit more time in case somebody's furiously typing.
Okay, well, it's been fun putting this program together. It takes me out of my sort of regular orbit of sort of Lake Forest centric houses and Lake Forest projects and Hunt Country and whatnot. They did other buildings. They did some things down in the south. They did a whole bunch of things at Port Royal in Naples, Florida. They did houses, they did shooting preserves and hunt areas down in Alabama and in Mississippi, a bunch of houses in Mississippi, cottages, vacation cottages in Ontario and in British Columbia. So they sort of covered the area, but it's kind of fun focusing in on Libertyville and Mundelein.
We do have one other question. How does someone contact you if any photos are found?
Oh, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn. Lori can connect you. I'm in the telephone book. I'm, sort of around in Lake Bluff easily. But Paul T. Bergmann at gmail.com is the easiest way to send me an email. As Paul T. as in Taylor Bergmann, and Bergmann has two Nancys on the end of it, so it's Bergmann at gmail.com.
I went ahead and posted it since you were giving it out loud. I posted the email in the chat so people can get it from there. So, all right. Okay. I think that's everything. We really appreciate your time tonight, Paul, and all the work you put into the program and your book. And if people are interested in the book, purchase a copy. We do have one copy in the local history reference section of the Cook Library. If you want to page through it, come on in. It's in the lower level. But if there's no further questions, thank you, and everyone have a great night.
Okay. Great.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Thank you.